Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 2, Halacha 3. This will be a two-part shiur in the Art Scroll 13b2. And when we looked at the last halacha in Chapter 2, Halacha 2, we're talking about when somebody changes their mind. Somebody planted a type of grain field, let's say wheat. They change their mind after they've sown it, and now they want to plant barley. What do? Well, you're going to have to plow it. You have to plow it pretty thoroughly. Not that thoroughly, turns out, but thoroughly enough. And you're certainly making a show of it to everyone else, so there's not a mar sign problem. Now, this halacha is going to be talking about vineyards. Vineyards and grain fields is going to be more strict than grain fields or kilayim between vegetables and vegetables. And the Mishnah is going to start off saying if it was sown with grain and he reconsiders and decides to plant it with grapevines, he cannot say, I will first plant the grapevines and afterward turn the soil. Rather, he must first turn the soil and afterward plant. Now, the wording over here is talking about the use of the word. It looks like it's talking about trees. Now, the Mishnah is not talking about trees in general. It's talking about grapevines. And that is going to basically be talking about Kilayim. Kilayim is going to be all of the types of legumes or grain that can be sown next to a vineyard, a grape, full of grapevines. And, we don't see this problem in the same way like with a fig tree or an olive tree. It's specifically having to do with Kilayim. And Kilayim rules are going to be more strict in many ways than Kilayim. Kilayim is going to be, you're planting two different species of seed. And by the way, that's not going to apply to sowing seeds of trees. And by the way, it's also not going to prohibit the sowing of other seeds along trees. But the only Kilayim prohibition regarding the trees is going to be, you have, yes, the ban of grafting trees and other plants, but you have the prohibition of planting next to the grapevines. That's where your issue is going to be, and that's what it's talking about. So, yes, it's saying trees, but it's only this particular kind of tree that's the issue. Now, in the last Mishnah, the way it worked was the farmer has to wait until the grain seeds have germinated, and then at that point, the plants are very delicate and they're vulnerable. And then he has to go plow through the grain. And after all that, he can go plant. Now, what are we going to be doing over here? And over here, it's going to be questionable whether the obligation to destroy the grain before planting the grapevine is going to be a biblical obligation, or whether his intention to destroy the wheat after the grapevines has been planted is going to be enough to remove any biblical violation of the Kilayim. So, yes, you do have to wait until you can't just plant it stom. You have to go and plow everything. But over here, we're saying that it looks like you have the same law that was already taught in the last Mishnah regarding Kilayim, and it looks like it's repeated here. But the difference here is that it's going to be more strict over here than in Chapter 2, Halacha 2. And really, over here, we're relying on the plowing of the field to destroy the wheat, which is going to suggest that you're going to be having to plow it in a way that's going to be much more strict than Chapter 2, Halacha 2. Chapter 2, Halacha 2, you could make the furrows pretty wide to do it. It looks like over here, it's going to end up being where you really have to be thorough about it. There's another case. It says, if it was planted with grapevines and he reconsiders and decides now to sow it with grain, so basically it's going to be the inverse. The Mishnah says he cannot say, I will first sow the grain and afterward uproot the grapevines. Rather, he must first uproot and afterward sow. So it looks like there's going to be a leniency in this case. By the way, the Mishnahs are not necessarily going to be the halacha. There's going to be some debate on a couple of the Mishnahs here, and the halacha is not necessarily going to be like this, but anyway, we're going through it anyway. And the Tanakh is going to rule on some of these that it's not actually the halacha. But anyway, it says here, rather he must uproot and afterwards sow. And if he wants, he can raise the grapevines till less than a tefach, sow the grain, and afterward uproot the remnants of the grapevine. So over here, raising the vines to less than a tefach from the ground without fully uprooting them is going to be enough to permit sowing. And this is going to be because raising that is going to undermine the growth of the vines, and it's going to serve as an indication that the owner doesn't have an interest in them anymore. And this is going to be enough to release it from the Kilayim regulation. Now, Bavli Baba Batra 80b is going to teach that someone who bought the right to cut down wood from his fellow tree must leave enough of the tree to ensure that it's going to regenerate. And you have to take down, in the halacha, up to a tefach from it, and then the trees can regenerate. And in this case, cutting the vine to less than a tefach is going to be an act that harms the plant to be able to regenerate. And that's why it's talking about to less than a tefach. But we see that there's a magical thing about cutting to a tefach or higher so that the plant can regenerate. And this is going to be something that's not necessarily going to be the halacha. What about if the plant can regenerate, right? Then you're going and you're planting seed. Well, is that going to be a case of Kilayim? And we're going to get into that to come. Now, again, you have this rule also like with cedar trees that we saw in Masechet Shvius on how far you can cut down to the base of the tree. And if you cut it too far, the plant might not regenerate. But if you're cutting up to a certain point for beams or wood, you can do it and still get the plant to regenerate. So that's why it's saying less than a tefach. It's really, as a Chazan Ish pointing out, is that it's really pointed out toward like a destructive thing where it's unlikely that the plant will regenerate. Now, the Mishnah is going to be teaching that the case of certain species regarding which turning the soil is not going to inhibit the growth. And now we're going to be getting into, well, what happens if you're planting grapevines with these other things, right? So if his field was planted with caraway or aloof, he may not plant over them even by first plowing the field, since they only produce after 3 years. So loofism is going to be a type of leek, and the loof plant can end up being in the ground and growing after 3 years. And there's one opinion, by the way, that what's being translated as caraway might be the hemp plant or cannabis. And why would they be doing that? Well, the fibers are going to be used for rope, and it's not necessarily going to display the same growth cycle as other plants. And I think that's what this part is trying to show, is that you have plants that are going to live for a very long time in the ground before they start developing, and you can't assume that the seed has germinated after you've gone and left that field for a while. So in the case of grain in chapter 2, halacha 2, you could know that something's been disqualified after 3 days. After 3 days, if it didn't germinate, it's probably dead. Over here, they're trying to point out that you can have these plants that stay in the ground for a long time beneath the bulb with these bulbs, and then come up and grow. And in this context, though, it's trying to point out that if this is the hemp plant, it's trying to show a different growth pattern than, say, like when we're talking about wheat. Now, the Mishnah is going to discuss cases of foreign growth that does not need to be uprooted from somebody's field. So, in the case of grain, which grew among the aftergrowths of Isitis is going to be woad. It's going to be used, the roots are used for the blue dye. What do you use the blue dye for? Well, you use it for dyeing fabrics, and you also use it to mark animals. So it was very popular in the old world, and it's like indigo, but not quite indigo, but it was very widely used. So what happens now if you have something that's not going to be a food plant, like Isitis and woad? What happens if now you have a field that had aftergrowths of Isitis? So it's 2 years later, and maybe some of the seeds of the woad sprinkled on and now germinated after the next season or 2 seasons later, and you're trying to grow a grain field, and now you have some woad plants in there. What are you going to do? So, as it's saying, in the case of grain among which arose aftergrowths of Isatis, and similarly a place of threshing floors in which arose many kinds of vegetation, and similarly fenugreek that gave rise to varieties of grasses, we do not obligate him to weed out the foreign species. So, again, what about the threshing floor, right? So, today I brought in wheat and I'm threshing it, and tomorrow you brought in rice and you're threshing it, and the next day the guy over there is bringing in barley, and the day after that he's bringing in spelt and oats. Well, you're going to have a lot of different kind of leftover seeds that are not there, that are there by accident. What happens if it's sprouted? Well, it's saying that we're not going to obligate him to weed this out, and it's clear that we're not, trying to purposefully plant it. And in all of these cases, you have these foreign plants that have arisen, and they're not being sown on purpose. And it's undesirable to have these plants growing on this kind of surface where you're going to be doing this kind of work. And I think that's what it's trying to show. The Mishnah continues, says, if he nevertheless weeded or cut down part of the growth, we say to him, uproot the whole growth except for one kind. So basically, if the farmer removed some of the foreign species from this threshing floor, but not all of it, we're going to take it as an indication that he's satisfied with the presence of what's left over. And so we basically are going to be saying that, remove whatever foreign species that's there so it doesn't look like he's purposefully maintaining Kilayim, because again, there's a Maris Ein issue here. So if he's picked one of these plants, say from the threshing floor, for whatever weird reason, and he's weeded out the others, and there's still a few of these foreign species there, and it looks like he's favoring, say, the wheat plant, we make him take out the others, it says. So the Gemara is going to start off, and it's going to try to box in the limits of Kilayim Karam. And we know that Kilayim Karam is trying to sow the grain next to the vineyard. So there's a related case that's trying to box in how far does this limit go? Because again, we see that Kilayim Karam is more strict than Kilayim Zerayim. Kilayim Zerayim was in chapter 2, Halacha 2, which is going to be mixing different kinds of seeds. Now, like grain seeds, right? Wheat and barley, for example. But over here, we're talking about a vineyard next to a barley field or something like that, where you're trying to mix it together, and we see there's strictnesses. So the Gemara says, we were taught in a brisa, one may place sheaves of grain alongside grapevines, and Rabbi Yossi says this indicates the fact that the brisa only mentions the permissibility of placing detached grain alongside grapevines, and that it is forbidden to plant a grapevine next to dried out grain, for it has been permissible to plant a grapevine next to, if it had been, where you're allowed to plant grapevine next to dried out grain, then the brisa would have taught this, and that would have been a new novelty. So what this is trying to show is that if you have a field that's close by of barley, can you take the part that you're, the sheaves before you take it to the threshing floor, can you place it down for rest next to the vineyard? Yes, you can. Why? Because it's storage. You're not planting it. That's why. And what about if you have a grapevine that's next to dried out grain? You have grain that's there now. Are you going to be allowed to plant it? And they're saying no, you're not. So because this brisa is teaching only this lesser novelty that we can place cut wheat next to a vine, the implication is that in the case of attached wheat, that's going to be prohibited. So it's trying to make a distinction between detached grain and attached grain. So if you had attached grain that was dried out and it was still attached to the earth, could you plant a vineyard there? The answer would be no, according to this brisa. But if it's detached, that's going to have a different case. That's the novelty here. Now, having discussed this prohibition of planting grapevines alongside a field of dry grain, the Gemara now tries to look at the opposite case. And it says, what is the law with regard to sowing grain alongside dried out grapevines? So we know that if you have a dried out, some dried out stalks of wheat, can you start going ahead and planting grapevines? No, it's attached to the ground. But what about if you have some dried out grapevines? Are you going to be allowed to plant some wheat next to it? Now, the Gemara is going to resolve this, and it's going to say that we can resolve it from the following discussion. A grapevine that has dried is forbidden to have foreign seed planted in its vicinity, but it does not render forbidden the produce of seed that was illegally planted there. Now, what this is saying is that although you have a scriptural prohibition of Kilayim, that's not going to apply to dead grapevines. And there is a concern that a dead one might be mistaken for a live one, since the live ones sometimes will shed their leaves and appear to be dead. But the rabbis are prohibiting this d'Rabbanan as a d'Rabbanan forbidden restriction because they're worried about Morasine. And the foreign seed is not going to be rendered forbidden, but they're worried that because you can't tell the difference between a truly dead vine and sometimes the case where the grapevines will be sort of dormant and the leaves will fall off and it'll be resting for a month or two, and then everything blooms and starts going again and the new growth starts. You can't really tell the difference. So it might look like, you can't tell which status it is. You can't tell if it's dead and dried out, or you can't tell if it's sort of dormant and resting. So they made a takana, a fence, a restriction, to make sure that there's no Morasine problem on there. So this indicates that one may sow us alongside a dried grapevine, but that we have a rabbinic restriction not to. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say a grapevine that has dried is forbidden to have forbidden seeds planted in the vicinity, but is not rendered forbidden the produce of the seed that was illegally planted there. Why was it illegally planted there? Because somebody broke a rabbinic fence. But is it forbidden d'oraita? No. The Gemara says Rabbi Lazar commented, and this Mishnah reflects the opinion of Rabbi Meir. For Rabbi Meir says in the following clause, the same Mishnah, it says, even a cotton plant is forbidden to have seeds sown nearby, but does not render the produce of the seeds forbidden. So just like Rabbi Meir forbids planting next to a cotton plant out of worry that it may be confused with a grapevine, he's also going to forbid planting next to a dried grapevine. But the sages dispute both rulings, and they're going to conclude it like this. They're going to say this indicates that one may in fact sow alongside a dried grapevine, and the halacha is going to follow the majority of the sages. So the Gemara is rejecting this stringency of the Mishnah, which prohibits sowing next to dried grapevines, and accepts the dissenting opinion of the sages, and rules in the case according to the Mishnah. And over there, basically, Rabbi Meir is maintaining that since cotton plants are similar in appearance to grapevines, and the rabbis are going to basically be prohibiting sowing seeds alongside cotton plants, Rabbi Lazar is trying to teach that in this Mishnah, which prohibits sowing next to dried grapevines on account of the similarity to these live ones that are just dormant, it's going to follow Rabbi Meir's minority opinion. But the sages dispute both rulings and allow you to sow alongside dead grapevines and cotton plants. So basically, it looks like the sages are going to reject this stringency and say that this is not a fence and that you can plant next to it. But the Mishnah is going to be teaching, if he wants, he can raise the grapevines to less than a tefach and then sow grain and afterward uproot the remnants of the grapevines. So again, everything that's cut less than a tefach is going to be considered destructive to the plant. So we know that there's a scriptural prohibition of Kilayim, which is not going to apply to a dead grapevine. But there's a worry that the dead grapevine can be mistaken for a live one that's dormant. And the rabbis are going to basically be prohibiting sowing alongside any grapevine, even a dead one. But they're basically going to be saying that this planting is going to be rabbinically forbidden due to a Morasine problem. It's going to be the appearance of wrongdoing. And then what that means is that if you have foreign seed, it's not going to be rendered forbidden if it was planted next to the dead grapevine. Now, the Mishnah is going to move on to the next view, and it's going to say, if he wants, he can raise the grapevine to less than a tefach, sow the grain, and afterward uproot the remnants of the grapevines. And we know that sowing up to a tefach, cutting up a plant, a tree, less than a tefach is going to be a problem for it to regenerate. That's why it's using less than a tefach here. But if you're doing a tefach or more, the odds are that a lot of the trees are going to end up regenerating. So that's why it's saying less than a tefach, because the intention is that it's not going to regenerate. So the Gemara is going to be talking about the case where you have raised vines and they're going to regenerate before they've been uprooted. So the Brisa says that if the raised vines began growing again, they are permissible. They are permissible regarding the grain that has grown in the past, because the owner became aware of the regenerating and forbidden, and they're forbidden regarding what grows in the future. So you have a case like this, right? The guy purposefully cut to like ground level. Okay, it's less than a tefach. So his intention was to destroy it. Now you've planted the grain seed next to it, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, it regenerates again. Okay, it's less than a tefach, but it just regenerates a new plant. Now, the question is, are the seeds that are there, are they going to be forbidden? And this Bryce is teaching no. So you basically nullified this, right? You basically are, going and showing everybody that you cut this thing down thoroughly, but for whatever reason, before you've uprooted these vines, they've regenerated and leaves are there and you have new shoots, and these new shoots now are going up over this one tefach limit, and now the owner becomes aware of the situation. He wants to know, the seeds that I did sow, that by the way I was allowed to sow there, are these now forbidden? And what about if you have additional growth once you've learned about this? Is that also going to be forbidden? In other words, you have this grapevine now has leaves that are now going over this tefach area, and you've sown the seeds, and now it continues to keep growing. Is that seed also going to be forbidden? Learned about it, that's going to be allowed. But if you don't fix the grain now and uproot this and get rid of this vine, whatever grows from your wheat is going to be forbidden after you've learned about it. Now, the case that gets presented with the same principle gets applied. It says, as we find the following incident, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda raised his vineyards in order to sow grain there in his stead, and he then told the sharecropper, go out and sow the grain in the raised vineyard. And after he sowed the grain, the grapevines began growing again. And Rabbi Shimon therefore said to him, go out and cut down the grain that you've sown. So basically, like what we saw in this brisa, that once he found out, so whatever is grown there is going to be permissible, but whatever continues to grow after you've discovered this, after this starts to regenerate, you can't use it. The extra growth becomes a problem. So the Gemara says, after the sharecropper cut down the grain, the grapevines now dried out, and Rabbi Shimon said before him, go out and plant new grain next to the vines. So basically the vines became unproductive, and now you could basically now go back and plant. You have a story here that is going through many phases of this grapevine and determining, can you plant? Do you have to cut it down? Or can you replant? And that's what this is trying to show. So the Bryce is teaching that when grapevines do regenerate, the growth that's already there is going to be allowed, but you'd have to take out the vines as soon as you find it out. But if you didn't take out the vine, you would have to cut down the grain. You can't leave both of them going at the same time. So the question is going to be, does this leniency apply to everyone? And the Gemara says that Rabbi Zera asked, until now we learned that the leniency applies to people such as Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who said wholeheartedly to cut down the grain when he found out the vines had regenerated. But what about other people who may say that the grain grew before the grapevines regenerated? would that be permitted? So the Gemara is basically saying regarding other people who did not say this wholeheartedly, perhaps even the grain that grew beforehand should be forbidden. So this rabbi, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, is being honest about it. He cut down the vines, didn't intend for them to grow. They were cut down to less than a tefach, but it grew anyway. Okay, they found out about it. They planted grain. He said, go out and cut it. The case that Rabbi Zera is saying is, well, wait a second, you might have some dishonest people here. And maybe they're going to say that, you're going to have people that are going to say that the grain grew before the grapevines even regenerated, right? So they're going to say, wait a second, I grew this grain first, and it already is grown. And only now, after it's already grown, now this is regenerated. And so the rule is that whatever grew before, you're allowed to keep. So basically, because you might have some dishonest people who might grow an entire grain field and afterward come along and say, oh, no, the grain, the thing regenerated now, so therefore I can keep whatever grew before, and I only found out about this now, wink, wink, nod, nudge, nudge, right? That's not really a real thing. Are they going to have to, are they allowed to keep it? And is this law really just going to be for a guy who's really going to be following Torah, like a Haver, right? Or is this going to apply to everybody? And Rabbi Zera is going to conclude that this leniency is actually going to apply to everyone, even guys who would cheat. And he said that even Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda did not prohibit cultivating grain next to the vines after they were generated as actual Kilayim, but rather because of the appearance of wrongdoing, in other words, Chazan Ish. And since the continued maintenance of the grain in the field is going to involve merely a prohibition of the appearance of wrongdoing, that's going to be d'Rabbanan, we don't need to be overly worried that people are going to be trying to cheat and they're going to be insincere. And so that's why they're saying that this leniency can be applied to everyone. In other words, what the Vilna Goan says about this is that Rabbi Zera is suggesting that this leniency taught in this Mishnah, that the raised vines need not be uprooted before the sowing of the grain, should not apply to Amoratzim or less righteous people who are going to refrain from cutting down the grain, even if this grapevine is going to regenerate. Rabbi Zera is concluding that since the obligation to cut down the grain after the vines regenerate is going to be a rabbinic restriction, we're going to allow everyone to plant next to the raised vines, and we're not going to be worried that they leave the grain intact even after the vines regenerate, because this is a rabbinic restriction and we're lenient on it. That's the point. Have a great day. We'll get to part 2 tomorrow about other interesting things with the stories of Joshua coming and entering the land and some of the rules that were stipulated when the Jews entered the land. Have a great day.